Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of Life Along the Merrimack. It's a show focusing on the history and health of the Merrimack River. With me is Sharif Zeid, City Councilor from Ward 1. Welcome, Sharif.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
We are going to be talking about the river, its history, and concerns about its cleanliness. And Sharif is a city councilor who does his homework. I covered city council for about 5 years while many of the issues around the waterfront were underway. And Sharif can be very informative. So again, I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Sharif, just to orient us, you represent Ward 1. Can you explain the boundaries of Ward 1? Much of it's near the river, is it not?
Absolutely, yeah. So Ward 1 really starts at the base of Federal Street, the corner of Federal and Water, and then it carries all the way from there out to the island. So all of the remainder of Newburyport in that direction, sort of on a jagged line between Federal and Water and Marlborough and High Street, and then everything out to the island. So all of Newburyport's Plum Island belongs to Ward 1, as well as a large part of the south end. And you're absolutely right, a lot of it is waterfront right there on the river.
And when we talk about the island, I believe about half of it is Newburyport, half of it's Newbury, and I think one of the voting booths of Ward 1 is out on Plum Island.
Correct, yeah. I think about 5 or 6 years ago, a deal was struck to utilize the old Coast Guard station out on the island as a polling place. So fortunately for Plum Island residents, they now have a place they can vote right there on the island. So we have Ward 1 and Ward 1P, but it's really one ward, just two different polling places.
Sharif, in recent months, there's been a growing amount of sewage that is occasionally discharged into the river, and that comes from sewage treatment plants upriver in Lowell and Lawrence, Manchester, way up into New Hampshire, as a matter of fact. Can you talk a little about what is happening and, what might be done in the future?
Absolutely. Well, I've had occasion, of course, in my position to learn a little bit more about this. So what we're really focused on is what they call CSOs, or combined sewage overflows. And what's happened was, years ago when some of these plants and systems were designed, stormwater was designed to go into the plant, and as well as, of course, all the sewage from the homes and businesses in those communities. Unfortunately, what's happening during rain events, which are actually unfortunately happening more and more frequently now, they're overwhelming some of those plants. And as a result, because they can't treat it, because they're simply over capacity and you can't stop the water from entering the plant, the sewage from entering the plant, there's essentially no choice left but to discharge it into the river untreated, which of course, as a downriver community, affects us disproportionately because it all is going to come down the river and end up here at the mouth at some point.
Well, we're at the end of the line, of course, and I remember several years ago in spring, after several days of rain, the river looked quite brown, actually, and Mayor Holliday did, have a statement out there, probably stay away from the water, don't fall off your boat this weekend, and that type of thing. So it can be, to a degree, where it's actually visible.
Absolutely, and so when it's visible, it's obviously quite a problem. You see it, and in some ways it's good that you can see it because at least you know it's there. But of course, there are other releases that we may not necessarily know because they're not 100% visible to somebody. It doesn't mean the water is safe or clean at that point for recreation or work or whatever the case might be. Obviously, we still do have some fishing active here in Newburyport. Got a lot of residents on the island, but a lot of users as well who enter the river from Joppa Park, for example, go down and kayak or things like that. So that's the public safety, public health concern, I think, really is ensuring that the river's clean for usage as well as for the health of the river itself.
Well, one element that I find disconcerting is that I don't think there's a specific guidelines that require plant managers of the sewage treatment plants upstream to alert the public or to alert how large the discharge might be. Is there a way to encourage them to be more forthright about this, to know, so people downstream will be aware when some polluted water will be coming down?
Absolutely. I mean, what I've learned is that there is some infrastructure for reporting today through the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. The problem with it is the timing is not synced up. So in other words, the discharge could happen, but it could be weeks or months before that reporting is completed, which is obviously not useful at all to somebody who's trying to use the river on a Saturday following a heavy rainstorm, say on a Wednesday. So there are movements afoot here. There were movements afoot during the last legislative session in the State House to create a better sort of regulatory framework around reporting essentially instantly upon the discharge, so that communities like Newburyport and others that are slightly upriver from us would know that then have a mechanism to therefore take that and change that to alerts and warnings for residents or users of beach and other properties. So it's my understanding that movement is restarted again in this legislative session, and it's going to need some work, but hopefully will get us to a point where we have a very defined timeline for discharge to reporting, and then hopefully from there to alerting those who need to know.
Well, one of the encouraging elements, and we don't want to be completely pessimistic here. I was talking to Paul Hogg, who is the harbor master, and when I mentioned my concern, he said, yeah, that kind of pollution is of great concern to everybody, but a year or two ago, they actually opened the clam flats for the first time in decades. And this was because, at least for a period of time, the water did get better. The clams that were taken, and of course are significantly tested by the state officials, were good enough to be consumed. Now, I quickly point out they go through a purification process. No one on the North Shore eats a clam that has not been purified, but there must be some good moments for the river as well, Sharif.
Absolutely. I mean, if you expand the historical look back a little bit further, obviously the river's in much better shape compared to, say, several hundred years ago or 100 years ago after, say, an industrial revolution type thing. But this is one of those things, the Clean Water Act is really one of the driving legal frameworks around these discharges. That's obviously federal, so not something we deal with here directly in the city, or I would as a city councilor, but that's why it was created, and that's what we're trying to adhere to and honor when we talk about ending or at least mitigating or lessening the frequency, the amount, and the duration of these discharges.
Mm-hmm. Two of the great senators from New England, and that would be, in my view, Ed Muskie and George Mitchell, they were around in the early 70s, and they were authors of the Federal Clean Water Act. And at that time, many of the paper mills in Maine and other parts of New England and other states, were very much against the Clean Water Act because it did cost them money. But the Clean Water Act was greatly successful. The Merrimack River was one of the dirtiest at the time, but as you indicate, it made a good comeback. Is there any federal money out there that might be harnessed for elements to help with the sewage plants upstream?
Yeah, we hope so. I'm not aware of any directly, and I did learn that a lot of sort of the last round of major plant updates were funded by the federal government. We're talking about sort of right after the Clean Water Act. To date, there's nothing out there today that's immediately accessible, but in some of these communities, the depth and breadth of the problem is so big, it's hard to envision a long-term or solid solution without some big money coming from at least the state level, but also possibly at the federal level, because these are huge problems that took decades to form. You've got systems being sort of evolving over time. It's not something that you just throw even a few $1 million at and solve. We're talking a bigger scope than that.
And it is known that there's legislation moving through the State House here in Massachusetts that could be helpful to this problem. However, it strikes me that we're thinking more about alerts and information rather than the state putting in a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? It's going to start with more communication and information?
That's my understanding as well. I think that's where we're starting, because right now the most immediate problem, as you articulated, is that people don't know when the discharges occur. So nobody wants to be out there with their kids swimming on off of Plum Island, not having known that 2 days before there was a massive overflow upriver. So yes, I do think that's where the form is. Money is always a challenge of government at all levels to find it, to fund things. And the other thing that's interesting about this problem is it not only goes beyond the barriers or the line of each city, it also goes across state lines. So some of the plants that are unfortunately are big offenders are in New Hampshire. So we've got every level of government, I think, needs to be involved in this solution. And money is going to be a big part of it.
But one of the intriguing elements of this challenge is that the Merrimack River goes about 120 miles up into New Hampshire, and putting in sewage, treated sewage, among other communities, Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a very large community. Is there any discussion at this point about linking up with New Hampshire officials and saying, you know, this is a two-state problem? Perhaps we can talk about greater communication and greater alerts.
Yeah, it's my understanding. I mean, like everything else, we're all working up the chain. So here locally, I know I've been talking to our state delegation, Senator DeZoglio and Rep. Kelcourse, who have both been on the sort of on the front of the state level things, which, as you mentioned today, are focused on notifications, but then dragging that up to the federal delegation, something we talk about the Merrimack River Beach Alliance meetings. From time to time, we had that on agenda probably 3 meetings ago, which is chaired by Senator Bruce Tarr, to take these issues up. And yes, absolutely, it's a multi-state problem, and that's the definition of federal government. So they're going to have to be involved, and the Clean Water Act is a federal law. So, you know, there's got to be some action up at that level to make things happen.
You mentioned the Merrimack River Beach Alliance, and that was active. It's always been quite active. It's about a half a dozen years old, as I recall. Several years ago, one of the key areas of concern was erosion, and I think that is always going to be a problem at Plum Island. But has work been done to kind of halt erosion at the northern end of the island, or is it just year to year to see how the storms go and how the tide is reacting?
Yeah, well, anybody who knows Plum Island knows it's a very dynamic thing, so you don't know where the issues are going to be every year. There are sort of hot spots that form currently today. Unfortunately, the hot spot is on the northern point, which is the reservation, northern reservation terrace area right off of the Plum Island Point parking lot, if you've been out there. And it has been a challenge. There have absolutely been some concerted efforts in the last 3 years for more dune nourishments, the building of a berm last year, which was primarily done through the city work, and then working with DCR through the MRBA. The DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, owns the beach out there. A lot of people don't know that the beachfront is actually state property, and that backs up to city property on Reservation Terrace. So again, a lot of interdisciplinary groups here, a lot of coordination, and that's where the MRBA has been helpful to bring those people together. And I think the big thing is a lot of residents have their eye on the jetty and wondering, you know, what's going to be the future of the jetty. The problems that have started really did coincide quite a bit with the completion of the reconstruction of the jetty, so that remains to be seen.
Well, the jetties was 2 jetties, of course, out at the tip of Plum Island, and they're about $10 million apiece, I think. At the time, it was the Coast Guard. I mean, the Army Corps of Engineers were talking about their marching orders were greater navigation for vessels, and it may have helped the vessels do navigate better, although I must say that the opening to the inlet is still very difficult. But is it your sense that the jetties have helped or not helped, or what is the sense? It's been 2 or 3 years, as you say, and has it been a good project?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. If you live on Reservation Terrace, probably not. But the jetty completion did create additional sand accreting in certain places where they were formerly in danger. So what I've learned in my position, this is my 4th year now as the Ward 1 counselor, is that Plum Island's a management situation. You don't solve problems. You manage them, you mitigate risks, and so forth. So some folks that were teetering on the edge of the water now have a great amount of sand in front of them, others don't. And so basically we have to recognize that it's a maintenance kind of situation, and we want to bring sand back in. Now, to your point about navigation, the river really needs to be dredged again, is essentially why the navigation quality has kind of decreased a little bit over the years. We've learned other rivers will be done more on every 2 to 3 years they may be dredged. I think we're going on 10 since the last major Merrimack dredge. So it's time, and that would help both. It would help with navigation, but the spoils, the sand that comes up off the ground, could be used to help nourish some of these areas that are having an eroding coastline.
Well, evidently the sandbar is a curious organism, because even going back a century or so, the sandbar might be in the middle of the river one year, and then it could move to the north or move to the south. And most voters that I've talked to, they go out the first time, and one of their goals is to figure out, well, has the bar moved?
Absolutely.
Should I be farther north along the north jetty? Should be farther south? Do you hear this? I mean, it must be a curious problem.
Absolutely, and I think Paul Hogg, as you mentioned, as the harbor master, tries to do his best to keep people apprised of where the hazards to navigation are. But it is dynamic year to year, and it changes. And then once a sandbar forms, it may oddly have a domino effect and cause other things to change around it. So, yep.
Well, historically, it's been a very shallow river at the opening. It draws about 16 feet. And when people wonder why Newburyport lost its edge in shipbuilding, which in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the leader in New England, one of the reasons is because as the ships got larger and heavier, they could barely get out of the harbor, and then if they were loaded, they could never come back. And similarly, when steam came along and iron vessels came along, they just could not get in. So I always think about that when people say, well, how did we lose our edge? It's shallow out there. A few years ago, there was a vessel called the El Galleon that came in. And it was a tall ship, and it drew about 16 feet. And people would come to Plum Island, and they'd see the El Galleon tacking off of Plum Island. And so I eventually asked the captain when she got here, what was going on out there? Did you get here early? And she said, a little early, but not by time. I was absolutely unwilling to come in on less than a high tide. She wanted the tide to be very high.
Absolutely.
And that's, her plan was to come in and come out with that. So you must talk to a lot of boaters. Do you get the sense that the river needs to be dredged again?
Absolutely. I haven't talked to anybody from any perspective that doesn't think it's time for a dredge, whether it's a resident or a boater. And as you know, Newburyport has a relatively new boating facility out there, so there's a lot of economic benefit as well to the city through boating, and that's essentially the argument we present to the Army Corps of Engineers, who are looking at hundreds of projects potentially to dredge in a dynamic environment as far as their budget goes. So the Piscataqua River up in New Hampshire was slated or potentially approved to be dredged. Hasn't moved forward due to a lack of funding. So there are all manner of projects all around the country, and Army Corps is primarily responsible. It's very expensive to dredge at the scale that they dredge, and you have to go through a series of studies to prove the use of the sand. Otherwise, they just take the sand offshore and dump it to offshore sites. When there are benefits for municipalities or for states, then they can opt to pay in a little bit and put sand on the beach, and that's what happened during the last iteration of this about 10 years ago or so, last dredge.
Do you get the sense, as we talk about the vulnerability of the river, that fishing has been affected by this? Is fishing better now than it was, say, 10 years ago? Is it less? Do you get a sense from people you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows that the commercial fishing fleet, in Newburyport has sort of dwindled, unfortunately, to a smaller level. But the recreational fishing is still around and still seems to be popular. There are several boats that dock down by the embayment there that residents or visitors can avail themselves of. So I haven't heard a lot directly. We've made a lot of efforts to try and maintain access out on the beach for fishermen who are accessing by foot. Walking out to the beach, and that's been a challenge too, trying to balance, trying to protect the dunes with allowing sufficient and reasonable access out there. So we're trying to do our best.
In terms of our own sewage treatment plant here in Newburyport, several years ago, there was a lot of complaints about the odors there, and the council, of which you're a member, did move forward, did put some money toward to anti-odor hardware. It seems a little awkward that it didn't go in the first time, but there you are. Do you get a sense that, that was successful, that the complaints about odors along Water Street have diminished? Because you yourself live on Water Street.
I do. Yeah, I'm very happy with that. It was an expensive project, but I think needed to be done. The council on our end, I think we did a good job investigating and asking a million questions about the system and so forth. And at this point, the proof is in the pudding. This past summer, we had a very good summer. I didn't personally field any odor complaints in the 3 hottest months of the year, which was typically the worst time, because it is a natural organic process that's happening at that plant. So you can't know what the bugs are going to do in the vats. But I think that's been a successful project, and I'm proud of the work that we were able to do there.
When we talk about the plant, one always wonders how much capacity it still has. There are several construction projects on the books here in town. Waterfront West would perhaps be 200 condos, perhaps 100 hotel rooms. There's Minco, a housing development down by the railroad station, and there might be a hotel on Route 1. What is your sense of, is our sewage treatment plant large enough to absorb new projects such as this?
Yeah, so this is something I've been probing around and trying to understand more about. Right now, it seems that the indications I'm getting is that the plant does have sufficient capacity to handle those new flows, if you will. What does give me some pause is that a lot of people consider the sewer plant to be the capacity bottleneck, if you will, but the collection system, which is the series of pipes, tubes, lift stations, and so forth that either pump or by gravity allow sewage to enter the plant, have finite capacities in certain places, and we have an old city, so some of the parts of that system are quite old. And so that's where I'm focusing my understanding more about is where are the pinch points in the system. Many know we just built a new lift station out on Graff Road. For those who don't know what a lift station is, it's what allows sewage to sort of defy gravity and go up and or be pumped to somewhere versus much of the old parts of the city which are just gravity fed. So that's, I think, where the biggest concern is going to be is, can the sewage get to the plant? But from what I've learned so far, it seems that the plant, once it gets there is sufficient capacity to handle it at this point.
When you talk about being a city councilor and fielding questions, you've been in for several years now. What are your satisfactions about being a councilor, and are there frustrations as well? And I would mention again, I'm talking to Sharif Zeid, who is Ward 1 councilor. Ward 1 is down near the river along along Water Street and Merrimack Street. And so, maybe you can talk about what it's been like to be a counselor and the frustrations and also the satisfactions.
Yeah, well, let me talk about the good one first. The satisfactions lead with that anyway. So
you can bring up the clams again if you want to.
Thank you. I love it. I mean, the best part is definitely the people. So one neat thing about being a ward counselor is just getting out there, knocking on doors, meeting a ton of people, sometimes in happy situations, perhaps more often not in happy situations, and having an opportunity to work with folks. I mean, if you think about the theory of government, there's nobody closer than your ward counselor who lives in your neighborhood and is available to you. You can call their home and ask them questions. So I've really enjoyed that part. I've certainly enjoyed being at the table, so to say, and having a voice to speak for the people of Ward 1, and I'm always honored that they would give me that chance to do that. Frustrations, I think, like anything else, there are some situations that are very difficult, particularly in things like neighborhood disputes, which sometimes there are no wins to be had. You're just trying to mitigate a tough situation. And the other one is just that there are things counselors can do and there are things they can't, and that's probably the most important thing a lot of folks don't know. Counselors don't spend money. We don't have money to spend. We're a reactive force. Mm-hmm. We approve expenditure requests. We do not initiate them. It's a little different than the federal government where appropriations start in the House. City government's a little bit different. But you know what? We try our best to work together and work with the administration to come up with good outcomes on all the issues that are important to everybody. So,
when we talk about Ward 1, and the marsh, what is happening with the Pink House? Now, for folks who don't know, about halfway down on Plum Island Turnpike is a pink residence. It's been uninhabited for quite a while. I think it's about a century old. There's a back and forth. It's on federal land, and the federal officials have said, geez, we'd like it off the land. And they actually said, if you folks want to take it, find a place, cart it off, you can do so, we won't charge you. But there has been a group here in town that said, geez, we've always had that here, we want to keep it here. Where do we stand on the Pink House?
Yeah, I'll give you, I'll admit I'm not 100% expert on this, but I'll give you the best that I understand is, I think the key, the linchpin here is that, as you mentioned, it is on federal property, and so the feds have recently changed the rules. I know this from other things on Plum Island. They can no longer give away land or sell for less than market value. They either have to sell at that price or they need to receive land and trade. There's not a lot of land around to be traded. So I think that's kind of where the impasse is right now is, can a trade be struck or can some way be found to keep the property? It wouldn't be the same house if it wasn't where it is. So, can it be kept where it is physically? And I think there's no shortage of volunteers that are interested and willing to take on maintenance and other things to make that happen. But I don't know if anything will happen in the near future. Things where the feds tend to move on the slower track. So that's good and bad in that situation.
One of my interests is the Coast Guard. And in about 1973, I believe, the Coast Guard station moved in from Plum Island is now close to the middle of town. Do you get down there from time to time? It seems like it's been a valuable organization, and certainly when we talk about boating and fishing, it's a great resource to have here.
Oh, I mean, I think we're very fortunate to have them here. I mean, you've got the harbor master protecting you, but you've also got to have the Coast Guard there for search and rescues, and just the security of having them is great. Germane, perhaps the discussion is the old building out on the end of Plum Island was recently considered surplus by the City Council. I don't know if people know that. So it's in an RFP process, which stands for Request for Proposal, essentially within certain parameters, asking if there are any parties out there that are interested in utilizing the building.
Now, by parties, you mean individuals rather than...
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Let's go party.
Yeah, yeah, individuals or educational organizations or what have you. Obviously, it's an interesting place to be right out there on the point the Coast Guard moved, so that gives you some indication of the weather they see.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I mean, hey, you don't. Not everybody has a Coast Guard station, so we're
well,
very
there is
fortunate.
a very popular restaurant on the Cape that was a Coast Guard station, so we'll see. And then this is slightly off the topic, but since my topic in my own mind is frequently the Coast Guard,
Sure.
so I've written a book that's coming out this early summer called New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Patriots. And I just got a note from the editors, and they said, we've got to change the word patriots to mariners. And I said, why would that be? And he said, well, our marketing department has looked into this, and every time we put New England and then Patriots, comes up the football team. And so, if you live around here and you know the Patriots, this is pretty obvious. And I didn't think about it myself, but I've kind of agreed that, okay, we can't do Patriots, we'll do Mariners. But, I'm looking forward to that and other things this spring. So I just ask you, and we just have a few minutes left, what are the challenges this spring for the City Council as they might relate to the river or to the parks or just general life outdoors?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the spring always brings budget season, so that's probably the top thing we'll be talking about in the context of the river and outdoor space in general, recreation, is, how do we fund those things and what are we looking at? What are our priorities? How do they all kind of fit in? We've got a whole host of other issues. I think New England Development's property down on Waterfront West has implications for the river. We recently closed up an ad hoc committee on that with some findings, but I anticipate that coming back in about 4 to 6 weeks. And I know I've heard from a lot of constituents interest about how the building relates to the environment, how it relates to the river, how it relates to stormwater. So if you could pick one issue that had everything in it, that would be one of them. Density, sewage concerns, flows and capacities and so forth. So I think that'll be a big one. And other than that, just ongoing, the same things we do all the time. So we're appointing people to commissions, so there may be appointments. I think we just had one to the Parks Commission, for example. And just continuing to work locally, I think locally on the river specifically, continuing to test locally is probably one of the best things and quickest things we can get to.
Well, that sounds good. And, you have a good read on things. And just talk a little about your profession. What's your day job and,
Sure.
and how has that helped you
Sure.
on the City Council? As I understand it, you're involved in information technology and healthcare.
I am, yeah. I mean, by education, I'm a business person specializing really in finance. So I'm big on the numbers. If you watch City Council, probably get that. In my professional career, yes, I'm focused on health IT, health information technology. So I work with companies to design, build, and sell systems that help support practices and take their patients sort of from the day they walk in until the visits are paid and so forth. So I've got one foot in finance and one foot in technology. That's kind of the world I live in, so to say.
Well, in recent years, I think the city's website has improved. There's good information about, for instance, when storms are coming along, we can learn from there. When school is put off. So I guess the IT element has come into the city, and that's an important aspect of communication.
Absolutely, and if residents are listening and you're interested in getting a push instead of a pull, meaning receiving an email when something is going to happen, there are a variety of email lists you can sign up for on the city website, and it's a wonderful way to just get information pushed to you rather than you having to go seek it out, and I would urge anybody to take advantage of that that's interested.
Well, good. I've been talking with Sharif Zeid, who is the city councilor for Ward 1. Sharif, thank you for coming today. And just for folks who are listening, we do this show once a week on Tuesdays from 2 to 2:30. and we're committed to the history and the health of the Merrimack River. So we're probably all here in part because of the river and the ocean. And so if you're interested in being on the show or having a question, please get in touch with us. We're going to be leaving shortly, but we want to thank you again, Sharif, for coming, and we'll be here next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.